Good evening, all of you. We are happy to welcome you to this. We are almost reaching the 200th event of CIC, and it's heartening to see such a overflowing auditorium today as we have two distinguished speakers. Most of you know them, you have seen them, but it's my pleasant duty to introduce them to you. So let me start by introducing our eminent guest who has come down from Delhi. A round of applause for Mr. Navtej Sarna. Shri Sarna was India's ambassador to the United States till December 2018. As a member of the Indian Foreign Service since 1980, Shri Sarna also served as India's High Commissioner to the UK, Ambassador to the State of Israel, and Secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs. He has the distinction of being India's longest serving Foreign Office spokesman, having held that post for 6 years. In the earlier years of his service, he served in various diplomatic posts in Moscow, Poland, Bhutan, Iran, Washington, and Geneva. Sri Sarna is also an established author of fiction and non-fiction. His most recent novel is Crimson Spring, which has been awarded the KLF Award for the Best Fiction Book of 2022. His earlier works include the novels The Exile and We Weren't Lovers Like That, the short story collection, Winter Evenings, non-fiction works, The Book of Nanak, Second Thoughts and Indians at Herod's Gate, as well as two translations, Zafarnama and Savage Harvest. He has been a prolific columnist and commentator on policy, literary and cultural matters, contributing regularly to journals in India and abroad. Ambassador Sarna is an advisory member of the board of the US India Strategic Partnership Forum, an advisory board member of the Kautilya School of Public Policy, and an independent member of the National Broadcasting and Digital Standards Authority. He also sits on the governing council of the Sri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi University, and also a patron of the Kushwant Singh Literary Festival in London. He was invited to be a visiting fellow at All Souls College, Oxford University in 2022. We have great pleasure in welcoming at CIC Ambassador Navtej Sarna. Joining him is our own. We claim as a Chennai Vasi, he has written a book called Chennai Vasi, so he is our own Ambassador T.S. Tirumurti, who is also in the Foreign Service with a diplomatic career spanning 37 years between 1985 and 2022. Incidentally, he is a batchmate of mine, so I have additional rights over him. He served as Ambassador, Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations in New York between 2020 and 2022. He was President of the UN Security Council for August 2021. He was chair of 3 committees in the UN Security Council, including Counterterrorism Committee, Taliban Sanctions Committee, and Libya Sanctions Committee. Prior to this, he was secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs between 2018 and 2020, in charge of Arab countries, including Israel and the Gulf, and Africa, as well as development partnerships and economic relations. Ambassador Tirumurti has previously served in Cairo, Geneva, Gaza, Washington, D.C., Jakarta, and was also India's High Commissioner to Malaysia between 2013 and 18. He was India's first representative to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza between 1996 and 1998. He served in various capacities in Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, including dealing with neighbors like Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Maldives, as well as the United Nations. He was also India's negotiator for climate change related issues for several years. He is also an author. He has authored 3 books so far, and many more in the offing, I think. So it's a great pleasure to invite our distinguished speakers today amidst us on a very, very topical subject, which I'm sure many of you are very interested in following. So, welcome both of you, and I now hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Tirumurti to conduct the proceedings from here on. Thank you.
My very dear, my very dear friend and colleague, Mr. Chandramouli, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank Mr. Chandramouli and the Chennai International Center for the invitation. I am truly delighted to be with Ambassador Navtej Sarna, who is a very, very dear friend, an extraordinary diplomat, and a multifaceted personality, as you just heard, and whom I have always looked up to during my career. And on this topic, his extraordinarily well written book called Indians at Herod's Gate actually is outside, which you can actually buy. The topic is, of course, a burning issue in more sense than one. When I joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1985, I was allotted Arabic language as my foreign language to study in Cairo. And one of the issues we had to be familiar with was the Palestinian issue. Little did I realize that one of the last things I will do before my retirement in 2022, a full 37 years after I joined service, is to discuss the Palestinian question in the UN Security Council. Little did I realize that the situation would be far worse in 2022 than when I started my service 37 years earlier. And that is just my story of the Palestinian issue. As many of you may be aware, an important stipulation which has been enshrined in the UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338 is land for peace. Land for peace stipulates, or it's a stipulation or it's a formula flowing from the UN Security Council resolution 242, which was actually unanimously adopted in 1967, which is widely regarded as the basis for Israel-Palestine settlement. The first operative paragraph of that resolution establishes two interlinked principles, which are withdrawal of the Israeli forces from occupied territories, which is land, and termination of all claims or states of belligerency, and establishing sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state, which is peace. So the two-state solution comes from this. But this quickly started unraveling. When the Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 were implemented on the ground, instead of withdrawing from occupied territories, as the UN Security Council Resolution 242 demands, the Palestinian Authority was given some control over only those territories where Palestinians were living in large numbers. So what happened was that instead of land for peace, it effectively became people for peace. And when the land transfer was being negotiated, they were not even offered contiguous landmass in West Bank to establish a state. Simultaneously, the settlement activity inside the West Bank was actively encouraged and increased exponentially, trying to create facts on the ground and make a two-state solution very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. When the normalization process between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, when that was concluded, and the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu proudly announced that the Abraham Accords have enabled Israel to substitute land for peace with peace for peace, without giving up anything to the Arab countries. This basically meant that one could have peace between Israel and the Arab world without respecting the UN Security Council resolutions or without giving anything to the Palestinians, leave alone a Palestinian state. In their race for normalization with Israel, the Arab countries even announced that Israel has agreed to stop further annexation, while Israel did the exact opposite by expanding settlements rapidly. It is also well known that Israel and Saudi Arabia were very close to signing one when October 7th happened. While I think normalization is certainly the path ahead in the Middle East, it cannot be at the cost of the Palestinian issue, as the world is discovering now. The other important trend, if I may use the word, we have seen is that is trying to convey to the world that the biggest threat to the Middle East is Iran, and that the Palestinian cause is not the most important issue to be focused on. When I was secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, I led the Indian delegation to the 2019 Warsaw Conference on the Middle East, which was co-hosted by the United States and Poland. Vice President of the United States, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and many Arab ministers were present in the Warsaw Conference. The entire focus was on holding Iran responsible, which was already under sanctions. But come year 2023, March 2023, we just saw the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia on Yemen. So what happened? So as you can see, on the one hand, the agreements and binding resolutions in international law for a peaceful resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict were being undermined. And on the other hand, the Palestinian issue itself was being relegated to the sidelines by big powers, with even the Arab countries seemingly agreeing to this. So friends, I've just recently written about how I learned that the apartment building that I had lived in for 2 years in Gaza between 1996 and 98 has been bombed and brought down. In fact, when I was staying in that apartment, my building actually caught fire. I escaped by sheer chance, but that's another story. But what is interesting is that the fire engines, which had those long mechanical ladders to put out fire in the higher floors, were actually detained in Israel at Ashdod port, I was told, and was not allowed into Gaza since the Israelis thought that these high ladders could be used for attacking Israel. I'm talking about 1997. This is just to give you an example of how even the most essential and mundane day-to-day things we take for granted here are viewed as security issues and denied to the Palestinians in Gaza. And I can, of course, only hope and pray that my friends in Gaza are safe. Friends like you and me, yearning for a normal existence and happiness in life. Let me make one thing clear. What Hamas did to Israel on the 7th of October was unacceptable. It was a pure act of terror. And as the international community has agreed, there can be no justification for terror. So nothing can and should justify 7th October attacks, which killed 1,400 Israelis. We have also seen the taking of hostages by Hamas. This is a violation of everything that we stand for as a civilized nation. And it deserves to be condemned. They need to be released unconditionally and unharmed. But does this justify killing more than 9,000 Palestinians in 26 or 27 days, as much as the Ukraine conflict toll of 9,700 civilians, but over 20 months? We are not even counting those under the rubble. Does this justify indiscriminate killing of women and children, who form 2/3 of those killed in Gaza? And under the guise of fighting terror, does it justify imposing blockade of all essential items like water, food, medicine, electricity, etc., and subjecting a whole population to collective punishment, or displacing 1.2 million or more Gazans from North Gaza to South Gaza. Israel, Israel understandably cannot let Hamas terror go unchallenged. Israel is clear that the infrastructure built by Hamas in Gaza needs to be dismantled, and the Israeli hostages have to be released unharmed. This is the basis for their ground operations in Gaza. The question, however, is how many Palestinian lives are acceptable collateral damage to achieve both these objectives? What happens to the violations of international law relating to protection of civilians in war? We have just seen what happened in the Jabalia refugee camp, which I used to visit when I lived there. The irony is that to make such a pounding of Gaza acceptable, we have seen the West and their media, and even some of our own media, trying to equate Hamas with the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. By doing so, they're basically saying that the Palestinians in Gaza are somehow complicit in these attacks. By dehumanizing them, they become mere statistics, and that makes it easier for the world to accept indiscriminate bombings. Or also easier to accept if, as the Palestinians fear, that they will have to leave Gaza as refugees, probably for the third time. But a more dangerous thing is trying to equate the fight for Palestinian statehood with this terror attack of Hamas, thereby discrediting the larger cause of the Palestinian struggle against Israeli occupation. As I said, the two-state solution has been the only practical solution which is also sanctified by the United Nations. Contrary to popular impression, ironically, the revised 2017 Charter of Hamas too accepted a two-state solution based on 1967 borders, even if they did not recognize Israel. While we condemn Hamas, how can we wish away the fact that 250 Palestinian civilians have been killed in West Bank alone before October 7th, where there is no Hamas? Those killed in the West Bank and East Jerusalem weren't terrorists. They were trying to prevent their land being taken away and their homes being demolished from expansion of settlements and creating facts on the ground, which is a transgression of UN Security Council Resolution 2334. Pardon me, there are all these numbers of these resolutions. And this is on the illegality of settlements, to which even the United States has also subscribed. Successive Israeli governments have strived to make the two-state solution more and more difficult. The current, what they call as ultra-nationalist government of Israel, is only an extreme manifestation, since they have openly declared their opposition to a two-state solution and their intention to annex the West Bank and not have any negotiations with the Palestinians. If they do not want to concede a state, then will Palestinians be allowed to live as equals and as citizens in one state without the danger of being cleansed from West Bank? That said, there is also no doubt that the Palestinian moderates have stood discredited, both from within and without. Their leadership, which includes the Palestinian Authority, has been systematically shown to be ineffective to protect Palestinian interests. While it is easy to blame their infighting, corruption, etc., which is probably all true, but if one cannot work with groups like Hamas, logic dictates that one should work with moderates and strengthen them. The big powers have, however, neither empowered the Palestinian Authority and in fact weakened them, nor did they persuade Israel to start negotiations. It's difficult to blame the Palestinian moderates in an occupied territory when the other side is working against a two-state solution and refusing to negotiate. But effectively, neither side has credible interlocutors to take forward a peace process. I'm saying all this is that because I think it's important for us not to undertake a unidimensional view of what is happening in Gaza. There is much history of broken promises, cycles of violence, and violations of agreements and international law without accountability. All the world powers are involved. And that's why the UN Secretary General warned that such incidents do not occur in a vacuum. Friends, as regards the ground operations, I found it interesting that the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, laid out some important issues to be considered in Gaza ground operations. This included retrieving of hostages, potential violation of international law by Israel, mounting civilian casualties and erosion of international support, potential for regional flare up, and finally, identifying whom to pass the baton to when the operations are complete. You will realize that on each one of these issues which he has outlined, things are only getting worse on the ground. The world is only reacting to the events as they unfold and to their own respective domestic compulsions, whether in the West or in the Gulf or in the neighboring countries of Israel. The West has reacted in probably the only way it knows, which is to fully support the Israeli actions. Even the Arab countries are reacting to their popular street support for Palestinians, which they do not want to get out of hand. The potential for regional flare up is real, even if nobody really wants it. If that happens and more civilians die, all countries will stand diminished for not doing enough to stop it. But there is a larger picture which everyone has now realized cannot be ignored. That is a lasting political settlement. Once the dust, literally and figuratively, the dust settles in Gaza. Israel needs security. It cannot be found through spending billions of technology on technology alone, as they discovered on the 7th of October. It can only come through a negotiated, just political settlement which observes binding resolutions and international law. It's time Israel embraces this vision, a vision of two states living side by side in peace and security. And before I conclude, let me just say that India has consistently stood for a two-state solution. We have been rightly wary of the fallout of terror acts in Israel on our neighborhood. So let us not underestimate the need for India to stand against terror wherever it is. We also normalized relations with Israel in 1992. Consequently, India is fully in sync with the Arab world in their own quest to normalize relations with Israel. India is also part of groupings like I2U2. We also enjoy the best of relations, best of bilateral relations with Israel and with Gulf countries. So at this point, I don't see a direct role for India. It's time the US and the West and the Gulf and the Arab world showed leadership first. The onus is on them. But we need to be fully conscious of any regional fallout, since it will affect India in more than one ways. Therefore, going forward, it is important for India to come out not just against terrorism, but also against the human tragedy playing out in Gaza. While humanitarian assistance is trickling in, the situation, I think, has gone beyond just a humanitarian tragedy. India is a strong moral voice, and we should use it. So I thank you very much for this introductory remarks of mine. And I would like to call on Ambassador Navtej Sarna, but just to, before that, I'll just make something pretty obvious to all of you. So I've been in Gaza, but that doesn't mean I represent Palestinian interests. So, and he was in Israel, that doesn't mean he's representing Israeli interests. This is not a college debate. The only interest both of us represented and voiced our support for day in and day out in my career is Indian interests. So I just wanted to make that clear, and I would like to invite Ambassador Navtej Sarna.
Dr. Chandramouli, very distinguished audience, and my friend. So as I was saying, Dr. Chandramouli, a very distinguished audience, and Ambassador Tirumurti, whom I've known now for more than 4 decades, almost 4 decades, and I still haven't learnt my lesson. After having worked with him in the same mission, in rooms next to each other, I should have known that if he goes first, I'm going to have nothing left to say. His thorough understanding, his eloquence, and his logic is difficult to match. So I won't try to go down the route that he has taken. Let me try to come around to the story in a different way. But I will start with the point that he ended with, as to how we have worked in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, or with the Palestinian Authority, which we have always had two missions. So I was ambassador to Israel, and there was a representative of India based in Ramallah. In Tiru's time, the representative of India used to be based in Gaza. But now we moved him to Ramallah because the Palestinian Authority is based in Ramallah. It made more sense. And I had found that sometimes the two missions got, not in Tiru's time nor my time, but in some times the two missions got so deeply engrossed in the issues that it became our issue and his issue. You know, you started. So in my very first few days, I asked the representative of India from Ramallah to come. He was a young officer. I said, let's come along, let's have a cup of tea. And we had a chat, and I told him right in the beginning that this is not our conflict. This is a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinian people. Is there a problem? Yeah. So this is a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinian people, and we are here in our respective territories and jurisdictions to represent Indian interests as best as we can. And I must say that both of us kept up that relationship. We would meet regularly. I would not try to see what he was reporting, and he would not try to see what I was reporting, but we would exchange notes. So you had to, it's a very, very complex issue. It's a very, very complex place to live in, even in peacetime. It's a very complex society, particularly in Israel, where you have people from all over the world have come together to their homeland. You have people of all kinds of religious gradation, from the ultra-Orthodox to the secular to the liberals, all sorts of terms which are like shorthand in Israel, which mean very different things than what they might mean to you and me. So you have to keep your head above all this if you have to understand it and observe it. Now, yes, sometimes some issues are personal, like Tiru mentioned, his long association with the issue. I always remember that when I first became a diplomat and I was issued a red passport in 1980 or 81, that red passport was stamped not valid for travel to South Africa and Israel. 28 years later, I went as ambassador to Israel. So the world changes. Most things change, some things don't change. For instance, one thing that didn't change in 50 years is October 7th. Exactly 50 years ago, except for one day, in 73, the Israelis were also surprised by the coalition of the Syrian and the Egyptian armies on Yom Kippur Day, which is a very holy day for the Jews. They are fasting, they are praying, they are at low alert, and the Arab armies attacked and Israel had to take a huge beating before they started recovering their land and their position. And exactly 50 years later again, you saw the Hamas attack. And before I go any further, I want to just underline what Ambassador Tirumurti has already said. There is no justifying the Hamas attack and what happened. So when we try to talk of the history and we try to talk of the background and we try to analyze it, very often it is misunderstood, particularly in Israel, that you guys are justifying this. No, there is no justification for the horrible acts of terror anywhere in the world for any cause and for any reason. So having said that, I think you already have heard a lot about the lead up, the negotiations, the UN resolutions, the positions which Tiru has detailed, with the competence of somebody who has been ambassador and in India's representative to the Security Council for 2 years of his term. So I just want to go back, since I see a lot of young faces, a lot of people who are trying to understand this, as to how did we come into this situation? What is Palestine? What is Israel? Why are they fighting? And what is this land? So I'm not going to go 2,000 years. Don't be dismayed. I'm not going back to the Old Testament, but at least 150 years. 150 years ago, one of the things that was happening was that the Jewish people were living all over the world. They were living in different communities. They were being treated differently in different countries. For instance, in India, the Jewish people were not discriminated against. So they were very much part of the Indian social fabric for the last 2,000 years. But in several countries, there was a huge amount of persecution, there was discrimination, and what this led to was a feeling that the Jewish people need a homeland. And this gave rise to a political movement which became known as Zionism. Now, Zion is an old name for Jerusalem. There is a Mount Zion in Jerusalem, if those who have been there will know. But Zion, in biblical terms, is a land it is the name for Jerusalem. So the Zionists were people who gave a political texture to the spiritual and emotional linkage that the Jewish people have with the Holy Land, as it is called. They feel that they, being the descendants of the people of Canaan, who were driven out of Israel, were promised this Holy Land by God. This is a Jewish prayer. Every year, the Jews are praying next year in Jerusalem. At the holiest feasts, it will be next year in Jerusalem. So it is deeply ingrained in every Jewish person. The importance of the land of Israel, it's called Eretz Israel in in Hebrew, and in technical terms, it covers all your West Bank, all your Gaza, all your Israel. So that is Eretz Israel. So when a settler says, I'm going to stay there, he doesn't think he's doing anything wrong. He says, this is a God-given right I have. So, if you have to start with that understanding. So the political movement that started, Zionism, was started by a journalist, a Vienna Jew called Theodor Herzl, who decided that, he was going to make it his mission to find the Jews a homeland. And they started looking at various places. And of course, the real place they wanted was the place where they finally came to. But before that, several other alternatives were floated. East Africa was floated. They sent some people, they didn't like it. Argentina was floated. The island of Socotra near Yemen was floated. But ultimately, they said they had this very interesting phrase that a country without a people needs a people without a country. Now, the presumption was that Palestine was a country without people, that there's nobody living there. It's a mosquito-infested land, deserts, nothing is happening there, which was not factually true. There were Palestinians living there. Who were these Palestinians? People ask, are they Arabs? Are they what? They are people who live in Palestine. They are Arabs. They are mostly Muslims. There's some Christians, going back to the Crusader times. And they were living there, they were farming, there were tillers there. Some were landowners, some were tillers for absentee landowners. Some were Bedouins, living a Bedouin life in the Negev. But those were the Palestinians. So Herzl then sent two rabbis from Vienna to go and take a look at this land. And the telegram that the rabbis sent back became quite famous. The rabbis wrote back, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. So when they got this, they knew that, they had to work harder. So Herzl worked. His successor was a man called Chaim Weizmann, who realized that the people who can do this for them are the British. So he really worked at the British. And why the British? Because the British had in their top powers some people who were what is called Christian Zionists, who believe in the Christian doctrine that the Hebrew people must have the Holy Land, and this will make the coming of the second Messiah quicker. So, this is another thing. So people like David Lloyd George, the Foreign Secretary Balfour, they were Christian Zionists. So when the First World War, I'm fast forwarding this, but when the First World War was going on, the British were facing the Germans and the Turks and the Ottomans essentially. The Ottomans controlled this entire area. What is Baghdad, what is Iraq, Jordan, Israel, all that today, parts of Europe were under the Ottoman Empire. So when the British were fighting the Ottomans, it was very clear they needed Arab support. And then it became the season of contradictory promises. For instance, there was a man called Henry McMahon, not McMahon like our McMahon line, but his spelling was different, but his intention was the same. He was High Commissioner of Britain in Egypt. And those High Commissioners used to be more powerful than chaps like me. So he was High Commissioner in Egypt, and he made a promise to Sharif Hussein of Arabia that you send your forces, help me beat the Turks, and I promise you an Arab state. Now, most of you would have seen the film Lawrence of Arabia. So that Sharif Hussein and his son Faisal, and Lawrence was an instrument in this, wittingly or unwittingly, which is an open debate still. So he made them this promise. Now it's never clear whether his promise included Palestine. There's been a debate about this. Now, the second contradictory promise was something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement between a British aristocrat and a French diplomat. And they sat down, took out a blank piece of paper and decided, now the Ottomans are going to go out. What are we going to take? Who's going to take what? So they drew what has been called a line in the sand, basically. So the Brits said, we will take all of what is Jordan today. It used to be called Transjordan. We will take what is present-day Iraq. And the French, they pushed off, you take Syria, Lebanon. And most of present-day Palestine or present-day Israel would be under an international body, and the South would be still with the British. So it's basically, without asking anybody, they decided who's going to take what. Nobody consulted the Palestinians, nobody, consulted anybody. The third contradictory promise was the worst of the lot. It was made by the Foreign Secretary of Britain, a man called Lord Balfour. And as I said, he was huge. He was in touch with Chaim Weizmann. He was a believing Christian Zionist, and he made this commitment to Lord Rothschild, big, rich, Jewish activist, banker, jewel, all sorts of big things. Rothschild, he wrote a letter to him that Britain will help get you a Jewish homeland in Palestine, provided nothing is done to harm the rights of the non-Jewish minority or the rights of the Jews in other countries. Now, there were two parts to this promise. Anyway, the war ended. They didn't know what to do with the contradictory promises. The League of Nations was formed in Paris after the meeting in Paris, and it was decided that the mandate for Palestine is given to Britain. You do what you want with it. And that period from 1917 to 1948 became known as the British Mandate. So in the British Mandate, there was a High Commissioner for Palestine, a man called Herbert Samuels, who lived on this very evocative hill in Jerusalem, which is called the Hill of Evil Counsel. The Hill of Evil Counsel is known as that, just to give you a side story, because that is where Judas made his evil deal on which when he betrayed Christ, Jesus Christ. And that hill is known as the Hill of Evil Counsel, just in Jerusalem. And the High Commissioner's house was there. Now, from 1917 to 1948, this whole project was to be carried on. You prepare a Jewish homeland and you protect the rights of the non-Jewish people. Now, what happened in actuality was that in 1917, the percentage of Jews in the land was 10%. There were 90% population was Palestine. The land owned by the Jews at that time was 2%. But then they had the organization, they had the money, they were coming in, they were buying land through these years, even before the Nazi story comes in. And the Palestinians and the Arabs who were living there suddenly woke up to this thing that, listen, our land is going. So what happened? There were clashes, there were riots, 1921, 1929, and so on and so forth. There were much like what you see, not the extent you see today, but the extent you normally see when something happens in Israel. A bomb here, fire there, a village burnt here. That sort of things started happening. Now, this is where the British then started cracking down more and more on the Arabs. And so they became not honest brokers, So the Arab rights were threatened. And the Jewish people started coming in. Now, very unfortunately, very soon, the Nazi buildup started. And the Jewish people all over the world began to feel threatened, persecuted, with very good reason. And they started wanting to come more and more. And the world sympathy also began to go with them. Now, when all this happened, the British in 1937 were quite up to their neck with it, and they didn't know what to do. So what do you do when you don't know what to do? You appoint a commission. So they appointed what is called the Peel Commission. And the Peel Commission came up with a partition plan that just partitioned the place and forget about it. Now, this didn't really take off. So a few years later, when the British felt the war was beginning, they felt they would need more and more support of the Arabs. The Jews were anyway not in a position under Nazi Germany's onslaught to be a great support to the Allies. The Arabs were. So then they dumped the partition idea and they made something called the white paper. And the white paper said no partition. This is 39. And thereafter, as the war went on, the British decided they don't want to keep Palestine. They don't want to keep Palestine. I mean, they can't keep the jewel in the crown, India. And Palestine is a corner of a backyard. So they don't want to waste. They don't have the money. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have anything after the war. And they say, pass it to the UN. Exactly. And, goes into Tiru's hands. So this is in 47, when India is preparing for independence. In February 47, this issue is referred to the UN. So the UN then cogitates on it and comes up with another partition plan. And this partition plan, I don't have the capacity here to show you maps, but you can Google it. The partition plan shows clear areas for Palestinians and Israelis. Now, the Israelis are very happy with this because you must remember, the Jewish people are under tremendous people. The 6 million of them have been gassed. They are looking for a homeland. This is the first time in history that somebody's promised them a homeland. They say, good. But the Arabs say no. They say no. This is all our land. You want to live here, but we are not partitioning this land. Israel declares independence without any settled borders. And 5 Arab armies attack Israel. The Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Egyptians. They attack. In 48, there's a terrible war, but the young state of Israel fights back and takes huge chunks of whatever the land was, except for 2 parts, which is the West Bank. Why is it called the West Bank? It is the West Bank of the River Jordan. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip and a bit more. That goes to Egypt. The West Bank is taken by Jordan. And this is where the borders of Israel freeze from 48 to 67. These are called the armistice lines. They are not, the armistice lines because that's where peace was agreed upon. So if you fast forward, what happened between 48 to 67 was really the building up of Israel. In 67, Israel, again feeling threatened, etc., launched preemptive strikes, finished the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, hit the Syrians very hard, and annexed everything. They took Gaza. They took the West Bank. They took all of Jerusalem. Half of Jerusalem, including the holy city, the old city, used to be with Jordan from 48 to 67. They took the whole thing. They took Golan Heights from Syria and really extended their borders. And this is why every time the resolutions come up, resolutions like 242, etc., Land for Peace, etc., return to the 67 borders. This is what the 67 borders meant, that you leave the West Bank, you leave Gaza, you leave the Golan Heights. Israel hasn't left any till now. This happened in 67. Then in the 70s, they had a peace treaty with Egypt. They gave back Sinai, which they had taken. They had a peace treaty under Anwar Sadat. In 79, Sadat came, risked all his political capital on this and made a peace treaty with Israel, recognizing Israel. Jordan did the same in 94. He recognized Israel, peace treaty. And then at the Oslo process, which Tiru has already spoken about, the PLO recognized the state of Israel, and Israel recognized PLO as the representatives of the Palestinian people. And the story after that you have already heard. So I will not repeat it unless we come to the Q&As. What I do want to say is, where is India in all this development? And again, I think it defines what we are doing today or what we should be doing today and all that. Now, India had long historical relations with the Jewish people, as well as with the Arabs. It is said that the earliest Jews after the demolition of the Second Temple came to Kerala, etc. There are all sorts. There are synagogues in Cochin. There are the Bombay Jews. There are the Cochini Jews. Now they are recognized Jews in Mizoram, and people from there have emigrated to Israel. So there's no denying the old connections. Before, India did recognize Israel after its formation in 1950, but did not set up diplomatic relations. Mahatma Gandhi was famously not in favor of dividing the country. He said Palestine should be for Palestinians like Britain is for Englishmen and France is for French people. We had also gone through our own partition based on religion. This was not something which was seen as a very wise idea by our leadership. And the government took a decision that we recognize you. There was a lot of pressure, David Ben-Gurion, etc. A lot of people talking to Jawaharlal Nehru and others. And it was, even Einstein wrote to him. So it was decided that we recognize you, but we will come to diplomatic relations later. The Arab relations for India were very important in those years. Became more and more important, obvious reasons. There was Kashmir, there was Pakistan, there was oil, there was all sorts of, there were votes, there was the non-aligned movement, etc. But even when we did not have diplomatic relations with Israel, we had contacts. Very famous people actually used to visit Israel quietly. Jayaprakash Narayan visited Israel as a socialist. Other senior politicians who are still active, and I don't want to name them, visited Israel. Israelis had an office in Bombay right through. First it was to take care of the war refugees, then it became a commercial office, then it became a consulate, even when we didn't have diplomatic relations. In 1992, the world changed because the Cold War ended. There was no Soviet Union left. The chessboard had been picked up and thrown in the air. So everybody grabbed what they could. And we decided this is a good time to improve relations with the US, establish relations with Israel, and thereafter, our relationship has developed slowly but surely in the last 30 years. This is the 30th year, has already passed, yes. We started with cooperation in agriculture, in water, in telecom, and then you had this whole thing about security, defense, counter-terrorism, and it really has become a very important and a very close relationship, which we have managed to keep, as has been mentioned earlier, while keeping our relationships intact with the Arab world. Now, when normalization of Israel happens with the Arab countries, it makes things easier for us. When problems happen between Israel and the Arab countries, we get put in a spot. So this is where diplomats come in, and to try to create space so that we don't spoil our relationship with Iran or with Saudis or with the UAE or with Jordan and Egypt, and yet we keep our relations intact with Israel because they are important. So that is why sometimes you see how much debate happens over every statement. So this is the Indian part as a broad swathe. I won't go into more details, but I just leave the thought that with Jerusalem in particular, and that's what he mentioned my book, thankfully. So that is the old Indian connection to Jerusalem is the Muslim connection. It's not the Jewish connection. It's not the Christian connection. There is an old Indian hospice in Jerusalem, which is, goes back to Baba Farid, 12th century. And that's where pilgrims have been going and staying, etc. So that's another story, perhaps for another evening. Now, where does all this leave us? Uh, I think this thing that's happening today can actually has the potential of regional escalation, if not more. At the moment, I think people seem to be careful. If you see the Nasrallah speech yesterday, it really didn't go that far. A lot of things are happening which Tiru has already mentioned. The building up of pressure in the US, in the UK, in Europe, of the people rather than the governments, in the Arab countries protesting against civilian deaths. Where that pressure will take us, we have to see. What is the role of the US going to be? Is it changing already, as we saw in Antony Blinken's speech yesterday? Is it already getting nuanced from a full bear hug of Israel to a little caution, to a little admonition? What is going to be the future of Hamas? Is Israel going to be able to finish Hamas, which is not a building, which is not an infrastructure, which is also not just the commanders, it's a thought? What is going to be happen to the political wing of Hamas? Remember, this is the military wing of Hamas, which does all this. The political wing is running, schools and hospitals and water bodies, etc. So what's going to happen to that? Who's going to come in and take care of Gaza? I don't see any hands. Neither the Arabs, nor the Palestinian Authority, nor the Americans, and not even the Israelis. They have said this is not our policy to annex Gaza. We don't want to go and stay there. So at the moment, I think everything is poised at the edge of a knife. And we'll sit and watch as we do. I think I need to stop here because otherwise I'm getting stern looks from Ambassador Tirumurti. Thank you.
See, what I plan to do is that I'll just ask him one question and then open it up for questions from all of you. By the way, just to supplement, apart from a kingdom in Israel, there's the only other Jewish kingdom in the world was actually in Kerala. There was a place called Anjuvanam, and there was a prince for Anjuvanam who was a Jewish prince. So I just thought I should mention it. Our connections are very, very old and they go back a very long way. I just want to ask Ambassador Sarna, see, the peace now, which, which was there, which supported Prime Minister Rabin to make that, leap of faith, if I may use the word, with President Yasser Arafat and finally do the Oslo process and try to finally bring peace on the basis of a two-state solution. So the youngsters, really, of Israel, they supported that. And they came out in large numbers. And that was really a time when everyone thought that things would go in a very good, very different direction. So do you think that the youngsters of Israel, now this is now how many? 30 years nearly now after that's happened. So do you think there is, the youngsters of Israel, there is still a constituency for peace? Do they understand that this is probably the only solution? Or how do you see this in Israel? What's happening there?
Thank you. I left Israel about 11 years ago. But even then, and from what I read, I think the country has moved much in the last 30 years in terms of political thought. And while, for instance, the left, which used to be a very active part of Israeli politics, and very active in the in the early years of setting up of State of Israel, everybody was left. That has faded away. And what you see is the rise of the right wing, the Zionist elements, and the religious right. You can call it ultra-Orthodox, etc. Now, this has been a steady movement. It's not to say that you don't have groups and people and youngsters, etc., who still go once a month. I mean, I'm not talking of war days, but earlier, and go to the barriers with West Bank and speak of peace. They are the people who are, peace activists. They are university professors, students, journalists among them, very prominent names, some of them. And even today, if you read, there are Haaretz of yesterday reported that these groups, NGOs, etc., are actually going and making sure that the Arab Israelis, the Arabs who live in Israel, which is 20% of Israel's population, I'm not talking of the West Bank or Gaza, is Arab, that they are not attacked and they are, safe. So this is active, but it's become very, very small. The groundswell is more right-wing, Zionist, and I feel that the current crisis is only going to increase that tendency. Unfortunately, the government itself, because of Prime Minister Netanyahu's desire to somehow stay in power, he's cobbled together a coalition which includes, people with long criminal records. I mean, ironically, the Minister for National Security, about him, there's a quote that a judge told the New Yorker that he's got a criminal record so long that you need to change the ink in the printer. You talked of Rabin. There's a photograph of this gentleman as a young settler who took the emblem of Rabin's Cadillac and showed it and said that, if we can get that close to him, we can get him, or something like that. At the moment, I think the peace activist industry is on bad times.
I'll take questions. Yes, please, you can start.
What does that thought stand for, according to you? And is it a stakeholder that, like, do people in Palestine support Hamas? What do they accept a two-state solution that India has been advancing as well? Thank you.
There are two questions there. So I perhaps we'll share these. But I think that on the Hamas issue, the fact is that it is seen as a militant extremist wing of a militant unit. It has a political aspect also. They have never accepted the existence of Israel, unlike the Palestinian Authority or the Fatah, which is the successor to the PLO. So they have never accepted. That is the thing. How much acceptance they have? They actually won an election in Gaza in 2006 and have been in power since 2007. How much acceptance do they have in the people? It's an open question. West Bank, less. Gaza, more. Other Arab countries also don't have a great appetite for them. They are seen as the Palestinian arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Egyptians, for instance, have no sympathy there. So that's where it stands. And whether the two-state, you want to take? Whether they believe in the two-state?
Yeah, whether they whether Hamas actually thinks that a two-state solution is acceptable to them.
See, what happened is Hamas amended its charter in 2017. And there they said they are willing to accept the 1967 borders. So they have tentatively accepted it. They even offered what is called in Arabic as a hudna. Hudna is a temporary ceasefire to Israel. So that is what they had offered. They had removed some anti-Semitic elements from there. But at the same time, I don't think they recognized Israel even in that changed charter. So therefore, it's like this, that Hamas also at various points of time during the 70s and 80s, they received support from Israel. They were not called Hamas then. Hamas was created in 1987, but they had, and then after that, they started picking up steam. And even at the time when President Arafat was in Gaza, and I lived in Gaza, and Gaza is the place where Hamas, is there. You could see that people are actually looking at the PLO. They're looking at Fatah. They're looking at the Palestinian Authority. So it was a very different context. And the PLO and others, they were also actually had leftist ideologies. They were not really having religious ideologies when it actually started. And it was a very inclusive thing, the PLO, because it included all groups except Hamas and a couple of others. So therefore, Hamas also realized that they had to start looking at, when you are governing territory, when you get elected, and of course the elections were annulled at that time, and it was no fault of Hamas, I can tell you. So therefore, when they were trying to reach, at some point of time, see how they can take this forward, I think my feeling is that they have not given up a two-state solution, because that remains probably the only practical way of going forward. But as I said, this is a bit of history, but it certainly doesn't justify what has just happened on the 7th of October.
Thank you so much.
Hello. Yeah. My question centers around essentially who to talk to represent the interests of the Palestinian people, and considering the largely ineffective Palestinian moderate and Yasser Arafat's transformation from a guerrilla leader to a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, how do you assess the potential for current leaders of Hamas to similarly transition from conflict to negotiation in this high tension environment?
Check. Thank you for the wonderful Jugalbandi. My question more works about the two-state solution that you talk about. Padraig O'Malley, in his book Two-State Delusion, talks that the two-state delusion time has passed. Do you think there is a need to rework our thoughts on this? That was my first question. And my second question is more on a lighter note. Bernard Woolley in Yes Prime Minister talks about if Israel, Iran, Iraq, and Jordan were kept in the same were kept in the same pew at the Abbey, it would cause World War III. Have times changed, and what's India's stance on that?
Refugees, who are they, where are they, and their right to return and its implications on this world.
Yeah, we'll take the next set of questions later.
You can't palm off these to me. Well, I'll just, see, as far as Palestinians are concerned, I think I've mentioned that, the Palestinian moderates, they stand discredited, and partly because of their own making, and certainly because of the fact that they were deliberately, being undermined, and that is something which I mentioned to you. So the question is, whom do you speak to? You can't speak to anyone, because there is no interlocutor on the Palestinian side with a certain degree of heft and credibility, and unless you want to speak to Hamas, which nobody wants to. The other side also doesn't have any interlocutor, and as Ambassador Sarna was mentioning, the type of right-wing type of things which are coming in, you don't have reasonable interlocutors. In fact, you may find it slightly difficult to find people who believe in the two-state solution. So it's not going to be easy. And, President Arafat being there, you mentioned, see, it was a completely different thing. He was seen as the undisputed leader of the Palestinians. And they felt that whatever he did was for Palestine. and it was not for him; it was for Palestine, and he had a tremendous charisma, and and this is quite evident. I used to meet him several times, and the current leaders who are there, you don't have leadership, and that's where you need to work closely on this. The two-state solution, I think the time has not passed. Everyone feels it is passed because on the ground, if you see the settlements, they have actually stopped contiguous areas of land. It has become like Swiss cheese. That's what they say, and therefore you can't even now. They say there were hundreds of checkpoints at various places even to pass through, because you have to pass through land which has been under the settlers and others. So my feeling is that it has not passed. It needs a lot of vision and leadership. Once there is a vision and once you want to do it, believe me, it will fall in place. Because ultimately, what is it? It's about settlers who have taken more land. But there is always been a debate about if you give that land to them, which is contiguous to the 1967 borders. Let's assume that goes. They always feel that they could compensate them elsewhere. So this has been a talk which has been going on. It's not as if it stopped. But the thing is that we need someone who can make this happen, and then things will fall in place. I'm a bit more optimistic on this. And on Palestinian refugees, see the Al Nakba, or what they call it as the catastrophe. That was 1948, and they were all driven out of their land. That was the first. The second set of exodus came in 1967, and in fact, sometimes people say, I saw in the papers, don't use the word Gazans, because you say Palestinians in Gaza, because many of the Palestinians in Gaza were not Gazans. They actually came in from Israel. So they sometimes even object to you using the word Gazans. They say, please use Palestinians in Gaza, because they came in the first wave, second wave, and now what they're really fearing is that there may be a third wave. And that is why you see the, what's happening about, refugees coming into Egypt and others. And there is criticism that, they're not taking refugees, they are stopping the borders. But ultimately, the Palestinians themselves fear that once they go out, let's say 1.5 million go out, then they can't come back. Then you're creating a third Al Nakba, which is what they are fearing. So I think it's a far more complex thing than this thing. But let me also say, out of the 4 or 5 important areas of negotiation which will finally determine a Palestinian state, one of them is return of refugees. But can you give a return of refugee right to everyone who left? No, these are all. Can Israel take this type of thing? So those are serious issues which has to be discussed when the eventual solution is discussed.
Yeah, I'll just come to the question. Just to finish that, when you talk of right of return, the Jewish argument is that what about us? We have also came as refugees with one suitcase, etc., from Europe, from Austria, from Russia, from Poland. Are they going to give us our lands? Are they going to give us our right of return? Now, this may not actually work, but at one level, the argument works. So it's absolutely. And on the working of the two-state solution, I'll only say that probably it can happen, but it can't happen on its own. It needs the United States. It needs a buy-in from the Arab neighbors, particularly the Egyptians and the Jordanians. But unless and until the United States puts its weight behind this.
My first question is regarding the Indian interest which you have mentioned. First is regarding the I2U2. Dubai has condemned the Israeli invasion of Gaza, and India has condemned the Hamas attacking in the Israel. So I2U2, basically they have the trade and security stuff. And where do you think that the conflict of interest basically arrives at that point? And not long ago, we tried to kidnap Queen Latifah, and we made it good. But what is the next solution for that? And my second question is about the cookie Jews who are working in the IDF. And there have been reports that they have returned since May the 3rd, since when the Manipur issue had been started. And they are currently involved in the violence, the Raita, which has spread all over the Manipur. Thank you.
What is the question?
The next resolution about Dubai and India on I2U2.
You know, look, the ITU2 is a very recent agreement, right? It's essentially a coming together of four countries on some very limited areas. It's taking only baby steps. You know, they're talking about something to do in clean energy, something to do, I think the second, no, not even trade. There's some, it's very initial stages. I don't want to worry about that too much.
Right.
There are bigger things to worry about. We have a major relationship with Israel. ITU2 is just a minor thing. So is this corridor, you know. So a lot of the attention goes to this. Look, if the fundamentals of the region don't work, then how can you expect something on clean energy to work? You know. So I think these things are collateral casualties. Terrible word to use nowadays, but that's what it is. I think we have much bigger interests with both the Arab countries and this.
Thank you.
Well, there are all sorts of analysis going around, but I don't know what is true, honestly speaking. So, and we might never know, or it might take a lot time to know. One theory is what you said, that the normalization of Israel with the impending normalization with the Saudis would have pushed the Palestinian issue forever into the bushes, and that is why they thought this is the time. The second theory is that, which is seeming less and less credible, that Iran engineered it all. From whatever is appearing, it does not seem that Iran has complete control over the militant units. The third is that they felt that the Israeli society, Israeli polity was so badly divided over the last 6 months because if you have been reading about it, then some of the right wing coalition took particular steps of judicial reform, as they called it, which would have turned Israeli democracy upside down, and the whole country was in protest for the last 6 months, including IDF people, including their people from the most top class units were on the streets protesting. So Israeli society was really divided. Settler activity in the West Bank had become so much that a lot of IDF soldiers were deployed in the West Bank to protect the settlers rather than guard this Gaza fence. So it took this army 8, 10, 12 hours to reach Sderot and other places. So there are lots of reasons. This is what analysts, journalists, diplomats make a living out of.
Yeah. All right. My question is slightly more broad based. Considering what has happened this year in Ukraine and now in West Asia, where are we going? Where are we headed vis a vis wars? I thought we studied about wars in history books. And, this kind of civil um, to destruction en masse. Um, what is the role of the United Nations today? So these are very serious questions which kind of, people like me. I thought I was born into an era of peace and I would probably die in an era of peace. But it really gets me, spooked up to wonder what is going on. I heard about Pakistan wanting to start war on Afghanistan, yesterday's news. So where are we headed?
No, let me just answer one minute, Chandramouli, just because it's a fairly substantive question.
just an addition. How are you? Navtej. Hi. Not just Ukraine and right now Israel, but also Afghanistan. The world, all of you, you study history, you identify patterns, which is what enables you to deal with the world at large on behalf of our country. But sitting here, it looks like the world is becoming a free-for-all, and like Madam said, it is terribly frightening. Is this what our future is going to be?
See, I think I thought I'll answer it because it's an important question, and I think many of us have the same questions. But let me just say that it is at every point of time there have been this sort of churning which goes on, and something else comes out of it. And this, when the Soviet Union collapsed, for example, there was a lot of churning which went on, and finally you had United States come as number one. Now you're going through a phase. I feel that we are going through a phase when the big powers are completely polarized. There is a fight for the number one, and there's a fight for the number two, there's a fight for number three. You have China and Russia having unlimited partnership, and and they are also not just challenging each other's position as as the leaders of the world, but they are also challenging values. The Western values. Many countries, especially the global South, they think that these values are applied in a very hypocritical way, and that is where the question of conflicts come. When you see Iraq, when you see Syria, and now of course you see Palestine, they are saying that what are all these values you're talking about? There is a lot of hypocrisy in what you say. There are double standards. So these are being challenged by countries. So therefore, when you challenge them, then you also give rise to people who sort of play with these challenges. There are also other things like, for example, terrorism has become a very serious issue in many. If you see Africa, because many of us don't even look at Africa, and my job was to look at Africa when I was secretary, and I have traveled to many, many countries. You have very serious terrorism problems which are coming into Africa, and many of them are inspired by by the Islamic jihadists, and they are coming over. We have military takeovers precisely because of this. And finally, about the United Nations, you said United Nations for the last God knows 10 to 20 years has not been able to solve a single conflict on the agenda which it has. It has solved one, but that's because of I think that was Colombia when it went out of the agenda. But otherwise, all of them still remain as conflicts, and none of the benchmarks are actually reached. And I was actually president of the Security Council in August 2021 when the Afghan issue came up. And we had to deal with it. Fortunately, I was there as president of the council and also because I was, of course, India was on the council. That was important. So we were able to reflect our point of view. And if you see the benchmarks which we had for Afghanistan, they're extremely important benchmarks which Afghanistan has to fulfill, or the Taliban rather has to fulfill. But I'm not sure when they are going to fulfill this. The problem will come when the world will accept Taliban without fulfilling any of the 4 benchmarks. So therefore, the UN Security Council has played a role, but the broader context of what is happening in the world doesn't let it happen. And this is a very important, the context but in Palestine and Israel, let me just tell you, it is a bit ironic. I am very charitable to the Security Council and the UN, only because that over the years, the only set of benchmarks which any organization has laid for a 2-state solution, for this and for that, are all from the UN Security Council. So in a way, actually, it has played its part. But when you have every major power in the world dealing with this issue, and for 75 years, they have not got a solution, it's slightly incorrect to blame the Security Council for it. So these are very complex issues, and now we are getting into an era where this type of, I would say, polarization is getting played out at a much larger scale. And this will, and countries in the global south will start playing the bigger powers against each other. They will try to get some additional advantage, and they have their own problems, and therefore, I think, and many of the issues we are facing are global issues. Earlier, it was regionalized. And my feeling is that we are getting into global issues, and therefore, it's going to affect us even more.
May I just add, since I think these are both very wide questions, I, I share your pessimism, broadly speaking. As far as the multilateral system is concerned, uh, the multilateral system, the UN, etc., is only a sum of its members. It doesn't have any existence outside the members. The UN Secretary General is a bureaucrat. And the minute he tried to say something, uh, what people regarded above his pay grade, uh, he was hammered by Israel and they asked for his resignation just a week ago. So I think we have to go back to the nations and we have to see what is the difference. There was a window after World War II when the world suddenly woke up to the terrible kind of stuff that had happened and said, no, we can't live together like this. And they set up the UN, they set up UNICEF, they set up various agencies, they set up Bretton Woods institutions, etc. But that window was very small, 3 or 4 years. After that, the Russians tested, the Chinese tested, everything went for a six, and the Cold War went into full gear. Now, what is happening today? I mean, again, I think there is a global loss of idealism. There's a global loss of values. The relationships between countries are no longer based, are more and more transactional. The real politic has come up on top rather than a value-based system. Everybody is in for what can I get out of this. And once you do that, it has its own problems. So at the moment, there is very little that gives you optimism. For instance, if the United States had really taken a leadership role on this issue, perhaps we would not have come to such a sorry pass. So we have to see where that relationship goes in the Middle East. That's very crucial. It went south, during President Trump's time. They shifted the embassy to Jerusalem. They shut down the PLO office in Washington, D.C. They shut down the consulate in Jerusalem, which helps the Palestinians. So that balance got lost somewhere. So I think, again, if you have to do something, you need a statesman of that level, on a global level, or a bunch of them who can just take us out of this mess.
Not able to hear. Can you repeat the question?
So the question is that a lot of young people are protesting in different capitals. How do you advise the young people how to choose between the two sides? Is that the question? And it's a moral problem for the young people, how to choose. I can't tell you how to choose, but I will say a couple of things. I think protests are a part of democracy, and protests, valid protests within limits of regulations which are allowed, are happening in countries and should happen in countries. As to how to choose, I would say please choose. My advice would be please choose on the basis of facts and the basis of your conscience. Don't choose on the basis of ideology. Okay? No, Firstly, I don't think it will help us to become a superpower. The question is, should India play a role in this conflict, given the fact that we have good relations with both sides, and will it help India become a superpower? You know, becoming a superpower is another game. I don't know if you want to be a superpower. We should just be a happy power. But as to whether India can play a role, I think there is, at the moment, honestly speaking, I think the Ambassador Tirumurti has already addressed this issue, that at the moment, I think there is little appetite for too many people jumping in and trying to play a role. There are enough people. We should let the people who really have clout there, beyond moral suasive power, real clout of money, weapons, etc., is the United States and the immediate neighbors like Egypt, etc., who will control what comes out of Rafah, etc. So I think we should keep our powder dry and let them handle it.
My question is, first of all, my name is Tangarajesh from Guru Nanak College. I feel very proud of standing before two intellectual giants. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us. My question is, there are so many ideas floating around regarding conflict resolution. There are another idea regarding the solution is that my question: what is your take on the confederation of Israel, Jordan, and Palestine as a solution? Is it a wonderful solution or is it workable? Confederation of three states.
See, I think Jordan is already an independent country. So now I don't think they would come into the equation as a confederation. And in the Arab world, the confederation idea has been, it tried earlier. That's probably what you're referring to. And it's not, correct. And it's not really worked. Because at the end of the day, they're all sovereign powers. And they have their own interests, they have their own this thing. So I think confederation, maybe that's an idea which could be tried out in the context of Israel and Palestine. But that will still amount to well-defined borders and the various aspects, starting from East Jerusalem and its status, and the borders, what do you do with settlements, what do you do with refugees, there are 3 or 5 or 6. So these have to be addressed before we can get to the state of a confederation. That's the way I look at it. Oh, sorry. Abstained, yeah. See, his question is, and why did probably India abstain on the resolution which was in the UN General Assembly? And obviously, I don't speak for India anymore. So, but what I can tell you, there are 2 very, very important things we need to consider when it comes to situations like this. The first and the most important thing is on the question of terrorism. And as I said and I have told earlier, that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of this. And once again, going back to my presidency of the Security Council, and I said Afghanistan just came up during my presidency, and it was just lucky I was there because the paragraph on terrorism is something which India worked very closely with the P5. And you will find it's a very, very strong paragraph on terrorism because Afghanistan is next door. And it is extremely important for us that the soil of Afghanistan is not used for terror against countries like India. So therefore, we have been very, very conscious of this. So therefore, when you have a terror act in another country, and when you're evaluating a resolution, you need to evaluate it, because after all, diplomats are trained to do that, to look in the context whether interests have been addressed. And terrorism is number 1 in our priority. And that is how we were able to support the resolution, which came out incidentally during our own president, 30th of August, 2021. We got the resolution out in the Security Council, not just in the General Assembly. And because there was a strong paragraph on this, of course, there were 2 or 3 other markers which were there. So I think it is important. India would have certainly evaluated this resolution on the basis of whether it addresses your concern on terror. There is no doubt. Secondly, that there has been talk about the fact that whether India was out of sync with some of the others. I mean, that was one of the things which was discussed. Let me put it this way, that India normalized relations with Israel in 1992. And now you're seeing the entire Gulf and the Arab world who want to normalize relations with Israel. So therefore, how can we be out of sync? In fact, I would put it the other way, probably they were out of sync with India. And therefore, I think when you look at some of this and feel, so we are with what is happening in the Middle East. And we are not out of sync at all. So given the broad direction in which the relations between Israel and the Arab world, how they are moving, the Gulf particularly, and the fact that we have our own interests, national interests on certain aspects, I'm sure these are the aspects which India would have evaluated the resolution on this basis. And they would have decided to abstain. So, but otherwise, I'm not going to substitute my judgment for what India did. But I can assure you that these are important issues which India would have probably considered at this juncture.
Hello.
Where was the origin of this, leading to this war? Where was the origin? For example, I don't know much about the history of the Palestinians or the Israelis, but the Israelis destroyed one aerodrome of Palestinians or something. When did it start? Who started? Who was wrong?
I think, Ambassador Sarna has spent the best part of his lecture explaining it. So I would just say that, there has been a history of broken promises.
Then why do you have to show sympathy to Israel when they have done some damage?
No, you're taking an ideological position. Yeah. But what we have tried to do is analyze it for you and say that there has been, you see, in the good thing about and the bad thing about this whole issue of Israel-Palestine is that there is no black and white. It is all gray. And we are trying to make sense out of it. There is one history which is there. If you go back into history, I'm sure everyone will have his way of looking at history. But you also have a future. Do you want the future to be held hostage to the past? Is a very important question you need to ask. So I think let us look at it in a way in which we can see how the future shapes up for Israel and Palestine. Where does Hamas fit in? Where does terror fit in? At the same time, where does Palestinian statehood fit in? Where do the Palestinians of Gaza fit in? Where do the Israelis fit in? Where do the So I think we are trying to make sense out of what we have seen currently and see which is the direction we can probably take, where, as they were mentioning, hopefully lead to statehood, peace, and security.
I think we have both of them, they're quite exhausted now. So if there are any very, very pressing questions, we'll take it offline. So today has been an extremely engaging, intensive, it's been an intensive and engrossing discussion on a very complex subject. And we heard it from the horse's mouth. Both of them have been there. They've seen, done, what we have seen, what we have read in the history books. They've been part of that history. So we are very fortunate to have Ambassador Sarna here, Ambassador Tirumurti here at the CIC, sharing their perspectives, enlightening us. In fact, as a student of international relations, it was a revelation to me. Many of those things which we read in our textbooks I was reliving that. So thank you very much for this. Thank you, sir, for coming down and gracing this occasion. And Ambassador Tirumurti is always part of us. So he's our Chennai Vasi. That's the name of his book. Okay, so thank you very much. And thanks for coming out in large numbers and encouraging the CIC. We hope to see you again on the 17th. On the 17th, we have a discussion on another very extremely important subject on the delivery of development at the last mile. And this would be by a veteran civil servant who has served in the Prime Minister's office. Mr. Amarjeet Sinha will be here. He'll be discussing on the delivery of development projects, why the last mile is always a challenge, why what moves from Delhi doesn't reach the ultimate beneficiary. So these are very important questions, and I'm sure many of you here would be interested in listening to this another important topical subject which we bring to you on the 17th. So see you then, and thanks for coming. Tomorrow we have another interesting discussion on Raja Ravi Verma's paintings. And those of you who are interested, it's right here next door at Wallace Gardens at the Apparao Galleries. So those of you who are interested, this is at 10:30 in the morning. It's a different time. It's 10:30 in the morning. So we would request anyone who's interested in paintings, art, culture, to be there tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good night.